Okay, I am Cindy Kelly. I'm here in Albuquerque. It is Wednesday, October 12th.
I'm Harold Behl, B as in boy, E-H-L, known as Hal.
Okay, and I just want to have you tell us like when and where you were born and a little about your childhood.
Well, I was born in 1922. I was born in the Bronx, New York, in my grandparents' bed, because my grandparents, who were Russian immigrants, my grandfather was a medical person. He had studied medicine in Russia, but then ended up being a pharmacist. He did not trust doctors, therefore his first grandchild had to be born where he could watch and make sure everything was sterile. And so they painted the walls and he sterilized the doctor's instruments that he brought in his box. And I was born, and after everything was quieted down, the dog crawled out from under the bed, they tell me. So much for sterilization, but I'm still here. At the age of 3, we moved to Long Island, within commuting distance of New York City, the town of Long Beach, which was kind of a sandbar barrier island on the south shore of Long Island, about 35 miles out of New York. Most of the people there, the men anyhow, commuted to New York City to work, about an hour's train ride. The town itself was about 5,000 people in the wintertime. And a nice day in the summer, or a weekend day, had maybe 100,000 people. So as kids, we always had a summer job with something to do with the summer people. I met my wife in high school there, and we were 4% of the high school graduating class because it was only 50 people, and we were 2 of them. And we went together while we were in college. She went to Pratt Institute to study art in Brooklyn. I went to New York University at the Daniel Guggenheim School of Aeronautics and got a degree in aeronautical engineering. And we were married very shortly after we graduated. We were married 67 years.
Well, tell us now about how you got into the Manhattan Project.
Oh, okay. I started college in 1939. That was when World War II started in Europe. The United States didn't get into it until 41, so that was halfway through college. So when I graduated, which was like, I don't know, January of 44 or such, I, as an aeronautical engineer, went to work in an aircraft factory, obviously. I got a job in San Diego at Consolidated Vultee Aircraft. They built 4-engine Liberator bombers. They turned out 1 an hour. And then they did other things, and I was kind of in the advanced projects area. And everything was great. I loved San Diego. My to-be wife was going to come out there. We were going to get married. When one of my local friends who I worked with, who was in the personnel department, said, "Hey, you know, we've been looking over all of the deferment requests that we have to keep people out of the military, and you're not 21 yet. By definition, you can't be essential to the war effort. Just by definition. You ought to do something about getting into the service." So anyways, I hitched a ride on one of the bombers back to New York. We got married 3 days after I arrived, and then enlisted in the, you didn't enlist in those days. You went to your draft board and you said, "I'd like to go into the service." And they said, "Okay, when next opening we have a next group of people that we're going to send in, you'll be on." So it wasn't like today when there's storefront enlistment things. So anyways, I got in and they assigned me to the Army. Well, I was okay because I had had Army ROTC in college, but I didn't get a commission because they decided that I was slightly colorblind and therefore couldn't get a commission in a combat arm. So, okay, I went into the Army. They interviewed us, and what do you think you can do in the service? And I had a copy of my diploma and a letter from the chief engineer at Convair saying I knew everything there was to know about the airplanes they built. He was a friend. I didn't. So, oh, no sweat, we'll get you into the Air Corps. But by the way, do you have any military experience? I said, well, ROTC. Well, what did you do in ROTC? Well, half the time you marched around and half the time you sat in class. Very good. What did you do when you marched around? I said, well, you had rifles. Oh, rifles, and they wrote that down. Well, anyways, I ended up in an infantry replacement training center in South Carolina at Camp Croft. It was a 13-week program, and I tried everything I could do to get out of that because the last thing I wanted was to be an infantry private in a ground war in Europe. And nothing, I had to start with something. When I graduated college, there was a government agency called the National Roster of Scientific and Specialized Personnel, which gave, I think, every graduate a number and an address. If you were going into the service, send a collect telegram with your number and where and when you're going in, and we'll make sure that you're doing something that you're qualified to do. Well, I did all of that, figuring nothing would ever come of it. And so here I was in infantry training, and I tried everything to get out of it. Heck, I even volunteered for paratroops, but it didn't work. 12 weeks into the course, I got called in, and they said, somebody wants to interview you. Went in, and there was this fellow in uniform, an officer, sitting behind a desk, and he looked up at me and he said, about your application to go to college. And I said, I didn't apply to go to college, I have a degree. He said, oh, would you like a master's degree? And I said, what in? And he said, what would you like? So, well, by this time I was getting very suspicious, So I said, mechanical engineering. He said, okay. And 2-3 days later, I was on my way to Ohio State University. A week later, everybody that I was training with in Camp Croft went to Europe as replacements for the Battle of the Bulge. Talk about luck. So it turned out that Ohio State was a ASTP, they called it, special training program. But everybody had a degree. And what it really was a holding area for different organizations in the military to come in, interview people, and take them off to do their job. And while we were there, to keep us out of the cold and off the street, they gave us graduate level courses. I got the first graduate level course given in the United States on jet propulsion, which paid for my food for the rest of my life, practically. Anyways, I was there for a couple of months. Nobody would interview me. And I was getting kind of annoyed. Meanwhile, my parents were saying, are you in trouble or something? The people have been wandering around town talking to the principals of the school, the police chief, the mayor, asking questions about you. So I had no idea. Okay. Then suddenly, yes, somebody wants to interview you. Same guy. He said, I have a very interesting job for you, an assignment. But we only take volunteers. So I said, well, what would I be doing? Can't tell you. Well, where would I be? Can't tell you. Can't tell me where I'd be, what I'd be doing. And you want volunteers? Forget it. I walked out. Next day, I was on my way to Oak Ridge. And that's how I got to Oak Ridge. Now, Oak Ridge had a fairly large SED group. When I got there, first of all, I had never heard of the Manhattan Project. I had never heard of Oak Ridge. Didn't know anything about it. So when I got there, it looked like a military camp, a very large military camp, and okay. And I was assigned to Union Carbide's K-25 facility in the laboratory. There was a small engineering department being set up in the lab to build and design gadgetry, all the mad scientist stuff. We had a glass shop, and we had all the bubbly stuff that you see in the movies. And we had a precision machine shop with a couple of guys that could build anything from the back of an envelope. And we had half a dozen really good engineers. And about half were military and half was civilian. My boss, I was the second one in the department, so therefore I obviously was the assistant supervisor by definition, not by assignment. But, and I was an Army private. Eventually, my wife showed up there, and I wanted to get her there. And once I knew that this was going to be a permanent wartime assignment, I checked with the school system there, because she was teaching art in Long Beach. And hell yes, we could use an art teacher right now. So she got out of her contract in Long Beach, came there, expecting she'd be teaching at Little Red Schoolhouse on the crossroads in Tennessee, to find that, I forget what the number was, 10 elementary schools and a high school with about 3,000 or 4,000 kids in it. Monstrous school system, and fantastic. I mean, this was, money was no object. Whatever she needed and supplies she got. And her art room was adjacent to the music room, so they could coordinate all their classes and things like that. It was really great. She loved it. Eventually ended up being the head art teacher there within a year. But meanwhile, I was still an Army private. And you could not get, I don't know if it's a written rule or an unwritten rule, but you could not get a promotion until you had been on the project for a year, not in the Army. Once you got a promotion, that was a single stripe. You became a PFC, a private first class, at $7, I think, more a month. Big money compared to $50 a month. And then after that, if you didn't get caught screwing up too badly, every 2 or 3 months you get another stripe. And let's see, during that time there were people that we had met at Ohio State and at Oak Ridge, and some of the Oak Ridge people had been sent on to Los Alamos. But again, even my job, and I actually was told that we were working on a bomb about 3 days after we got there. One of the senior scientists in the lab called me to his office, closed the door, and said, "Okay, you've been here for 3 days. What are we doing?" And I said, "Something to do with atomic energy, maybe?" "Yeah, what?" "Gee, I don't know, trains, ships, power." He says, "You'll do fine. You're a civilian like the rest of us, a natural-born civilian like the rest of us." He says, "We're building a bomb." And that's how I found out. My wife never did know until we actually saw the headlines in the newspapers. Most people in Oak Ridge didn't know that we were working on a bomb. Remember, we had 3 plants there. Each one was developing a separate method of separating the fissionable isotope of uranium. Oak Ridge was the uranium plant. Hanford was the plutonium plant. Los Alamos was the place where you put it together and made it work. And of course, the Manhattan Project was essentially in competition with the rest of the world. The Japanese had an atomic program, weapon program. The Germans had a program, and I'm not sure who else. I don't think the Chinese did. They were too busy fighting each other. But anyways, there were all these programs, especially the Germans, where people were really afraid that the Germans were ahead of us because they had essentially discovered fission. So that when it came to how do you separate this 0.7% of the uranium that is fissionable from the rest of it in industrial quantities, it's real easy to do it a molecule at a time with a pair of tweezers maybe. But anyways, how do you do it in industrial quantities? They couldn't afford to pick one concept, because if it didn't work, they'd have to start from scratch with the next one and you'd lose a year. So they went ahead and they built the 3 complete plants in Oak Ridge with 3 different methods. One was run by Union Carbide, one by Eastman Kodak, and who was the other one? Oh, DuPont. So I was in the K25 plant, which was gaseous diffusion, and that was run by Union Carbide. The gaseous diffusion plant had to have the uranium in a gaseous state, and therefore they used what they called uranium hexafluoride, and made a chemical conglomeration with it, but with fluorine. Fluorine is an extremely, extremely corrosive material. Hydrofluoric acid can't be kept in a glass jar. It eats up the glass jar. I mean, so because of that, there were so many precautions taken in the plant that nobody would be exposed to this hexafluoride. All of the joints were welded. The pipes were made out of pure nickel as opposed to stainless steel. There were all kinds of neat things. So people thought we must be making a poison gas. And so that 90% of the people you would talk to at Oak Ridge absolutely knew what was going on. They knew it was poison gas, but they couldn't talk about it. Now, my wife didn't know anything about what was going on. She was absolutely shocked when she saw the headlines. You mean that's what we've been doing?
So how much did you know about, if you can remember, what was going on at other parts of Oak Ridge? Like what was going on?
We knew that there were 3 plants. I had no idea what was going on in the other 2 plants. There was no way I could get into them. And even within the K25 area, you had to have special markings on your badge. The top of the badges had sort of like today's military ribbons, with the stripes, with different colors for different areas. It was also very useful because some of the local guards couldn't read, but if you painted the door yellow and the guy had a yellow stripe, that was pretty good. You could let him in. So no, I knew nothing about, in fact, I didn't even know anything about Hanford. I knew about Los Alamos because people like friends of mine who were assigned there after Oak Ridge, but I didn't know what they were doing.
After you were told that it was going to be a bomb, 3 days into your assignment there, were you curious about what kind of bomb this was going to be?
Oh, well, we knew, I mean, you knew the basic concepts, you had to have a critical mass and you had to be very fast putting the pieces together. That type of thing, but no, the actual mechanisms and such, no, we didn't know anything about that. That was Los Alamos. We produced uranium.
Had you known anything about the work that Enrico Fermi did at Chicago, particularly the initial reactor?
Didn't know anything about that, but we did know a lot of the Oak Ridge work was done at Columbia by, who was it, Dunning and other people like that, Urey. Our lab director was kind of fascinating. If anybody important came in for some reason or another, he would tell them that he'd like to have 10 minutes to have them talk to his staff. Now, they wouldn't tell us details of what they were doing, but they kind of bounce around the edges and things like that. And I got to shake hands with a couple of Nobel Prize winners who didn't have the foggiest idea who they were shaking hands with, but I knew. But so that was pretty neat. And of course, I had this, I would call him the chief scientist there, who kind of took me under his wing and said, "Hal, I'm going to make a physicist out of you." You know, because I was just a damned engineer, you know. And
Who was that scientist?
Harold Behl. Well, I don't know that he was the chief scientist, but he was kind of the senior one that I, from where I was sitting. I don't think there were titles of them other than the director of the lab, but I've always felt that he was the he was kind of the top scientist there. Now maybe because he was older than anybody, he might have been 35 years old or something like that. But
so were you? Did you have a sense of what the K-25 building was like?
oh yeah, I was able to go out into the building, and
Can you describe it?
huge. It was a big building, and it's the kind of thing that you'd never seen before, or I'd never seen before. And I knew how it was working, and what the process was. So it had a good feel for it. But other than that, it was just hey, that was the process area.
So if you went to visit, which floor would you go to? Did you go up to the operational level, or were you down on?
I don't remember really. I guess the only reason I would have gone there was for some specific reason, for some specific thing. It wasn't, in those days, you didn't just wander around staring at things. Oh yeah, how pretty.
Exactly.
No.
Yeah. Right.
In fact, the security was very, very, very tight. It was sometimes a little bit scary, but it was interesting because they would tell us about security and signs all over the place. But there was a book written by a couple of physics professors, I think from Harvard or Yale, one of the two, Pollard and Davidson. I think it was called Applied Nuclear Physics. And there was one page in there that talked about fission and had a statement that said, and I'm trying to paraphrase it, but it's probably not exact, that if you wake up one morning and find that half the United States has been blown into the ocean, you know that somebody has succeeded in producing a bomb. Now this was before the war, and it wasn't classified. And I was in Knoxville one day shopping, and I found a copy of it and brought it back on the bus, because we didn't have cars in those days. And the next day, somebody came over to my office at the lab and said, yesterday you were seen with a copy of Pollard and Davidson's book. Why don't you just put that away somewhere quietly? And you should know better than to walk around with that thing in the open. So they obviously had people on the buses and such who knew what to look for. But that was my only problem with security and all there. Other than that, is you just didn't talk about things. Everything had code words. And,
I have learned from some interviews that that people were recruited to actually spy on their colleagues and write little reports if they noticed somebody.
Oh, nobody ever approached me or any of the people I know to do that. Because, it was a very, sort of like a college town type of thing, too. I mean, you had all these young people, and within the laboratory group and the SED group, everybody had college degrees, and they were all, within 10 years or so of age. And we had some wild parties and did a lot of interesting things together. Really, yeah, it was really a great place to grow up. And I'm talking about, 21-year-old kids growing up. And, so many of us were just newly married, and we had never lived by ourselves. And, one of the things was that as a SED person who could not leave, I could not get housing, because all the housing was military that they allotted to the various companies, but it was all government housing. And it was allotted on the basis of location and size according to rank, or how important you were. And it didn't matter what kind of a job you had. If you were in the military, I didn't know anyone that had housing. We said, what we had to do was rent rooms from civilians, and usually paid them about as much as they paid the government for the housing. We lived at different times with a physicist, a single male physicist, a Tennessee farm couple, another teacher, one of Reggie's teacher friends, who went home for the summer vacation back to wherever she went back to. And as long as we would take care of her cats and her chickens, why, I'd pay her rent. We could live in the house, so we lived in the house. And that was an interesting story, too, because here we're talking about me. Here was a young couple who grew up in more or less of a city environment. And yet, if we wanted, we felt really rich, wanted chicken for dinner, Reggie had to go down to the farmer's market and buy a live chicken, bring it back on the bus, holding it by the legs. And then I had to chop its head off, running around like a chicken with its head cut off. It works. That's the way it is. But I'd never done that before. Then we had to pluck it. And oh my gosh, here's these pin feathers sticking out. We thought they were worms. Reggie called the health department about it. Of course, it wasn't. But anyways, that's the kind of thing that we had to do. Things were really unusual. So, because we didn't have any vehicles, and it was wartime, hitchhiking was a safe thing. Women could hitchhike and such. So one time, Reggie was hitchhiking down to the supermarket, and she was picked up by a old farmer who lived in they left a few of the locals in their farmhouses within the reservation. I don't know what they had them doing or such, but they did. So he was going down in this rattly old truck, and he took her down there. And she noticed that while she was walking around, he was following her. So here, again, this is a 21-year-old kid. She was getting kind of scared. And she confronted him. And it turned out that he couldn't read. And he wanted to ask her to read the labels on cans and boxes and things. And she did. And he took her back. And the next day, to show his gratitude, he brought her 3 young live chickens, which she threw in the pen with our house owner lessers chickens. They in turn, we didn't know that, attacked the new chickens, and the chickens flew the coop. And she spent the whole day trying to catch them, and she couldn't. When I came home, she was in tears. Because she had this wonderful thing. She had gotten these free chickens, and everything was fine, and now they're all gone.
Oh, dear.
Great experiences.
So where was that house, for example? Like,
It was on Outer Drive. There was a ridge where the views were magnificent, looking out over the Cumberlands. In fact, Reggie's school that she taught in was the Highland View School, which was up on the top there. But toward the end of the, I would guess, 6 months before we got our discharges, the local powers that be discovered that they had a number of what they call victory cottages, little plywood buildings that were, maybe 25 feet on a side, that were divided into 2 apartments with a sort of a living room, kitchen, and a bedroom, bath, but plywood. Like, for instance, the Crosslands. Doug was the one who ended up at Rocky Flats, lived on the other side. We didn't have an alarm clock, so in the morning, Gene would bang on the plywood wall, and so we all knew to get up. Even having an alarm clock was a big deal. And these houses had, in the middle of the kitchen living room, or not in the middle, but on the wall, a cast iron wood-burning stove that had been converted to kerosene. And they would have a 50-gallon drum of kerosene up at the road, and you'd go back and forth with a gallon jug to fill your stove, which heated the place and your hot water, and you cooked on it. So summer in Tennessee, if you wanted to cook, you heated the house. Very interesting. And again, for a young kid, city kid, this was wild. This is Raccoon Avenue, 721 Raccoon Avenue. And we lived there until, in fact, it was on the side of a hill. So the back of the house was maybe 10 feet off the ground, and the front was right at the road level. And the wind would come up the hill and through the cracks on the floor. So we ended up blowing a lot of our money and buying a linoleum rug that we put on the floor of the living room. And you could watch when the wind was blowing, the waves going like this across the living room. Anyways, it was ours. It was the first thing that was actually ours, that we lived in all by ourselves.
some people talk about going to dances on the tennis courts.
Oh yeah,
down by the
well
guest
there
house.
were lots of activities, and again, remember, this was the kind of thing where the only sidewalks were in downtown area, Jackson Square town site we used to call it. Elsewhere, the women wore boots most of the time because of the mud and the dust and the dirt. And if you went to a dance, they'd carry their dancing shoes with them in a bag. But there were theaters, and there were recreation centers that would have dances and such. And the SED had its own little club, PX type of thing. You could get beer and toothpaste and, you know, all the important things.
Do you remember where that was?
In the barracks area. There was a barracks area that was SED's collection of little buildings that were for the unmarried. If you were married and you had your wife there, you didn't have to live within. We had a lot of privileges. You didn't have to live in the barracks area. And we had what they called Class A passes, which allowed us to be away for 3 days. You had to sign out, but you didn't have to go through a whole rigmarole about vacations and leaves and that kind of stuff. It wasn't a formal leave. We got paid by check rather than cash. We
These
really
are the SED or the married SED?
the SED,
SED,
all
yeah.
the SED. Yeah.
Okay.
We didn't have an awful lot of military duties. I think once a month we had a meeting where the young captain who was the military person in charge of the SED, Bill Barger, his name was, would get up on a table in the cafeteria and start off usually with, "Will you guys stop antagonizing the regular military people? I'm getting tired of making excuses for you." You know, things like that. And then, you know, to tell us all the things that they had to tell us and such.
So could there be, I mean, I've read figures as many, like 1,300?
There were about 1,200 SED at Oak Ridge, and I don't know how many elsewhere. But I mean, I just heard that number. I don't know for sure. And the thing was that the people worked in shifts also because the place was working 24 hours a day. So that meant that the barracks area was always a mess. There was always some people sleeping, people wandering around doing things. So they couldn't be very military. I lived in the barracks area for a month, I guess, until Reggie came out there, and then we rented a room. And I'll show you. She made little posters we put up on the telephone poles asking for people, "Would you please rent us a room?"
And it worked.
I'll show you pictures, yeah.
Oh, good. This is terrific. Wow, it's very entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's great.
Well, you had to do something.
Yeah.
So let's see, what else?
What about African Americans who worked at Oak Ridge? Did you encounter them? Are they part of your?
I don't remember any in the technical areas. I think the reason that they gave the SED folks the victory cottages was that the the blacks had enough. I mean, they had segregated areas for black people. In fact, if you were black and unmarried, you were segregated to men and women in different areas that were under guard and fenced. But again, we didn't go over to any of these areas because you just stayed within your own little box. So, yeah, blacks were there as laborers. Remember, this was a southern state during World War II. So segregation was still pretty strong. Actually, you know, women had problems there. In our lab, which had maybe, I'm guessing now, 50 to 100 people, I think there was one woman who was technical, and we had one very vivacious young lady who was in our engineering department, and she kind of acted as a draftsman, secretary, type of person. And so and she married one of the SED guys eventually, and they moved to Orlando, Florida, and then he retired. They lived on their boat, their sailboat in Key West, which was kind of neat.
But you say they had problems there. Those that you noticed, was it hard to be? They were clearly a minority. If you describe,
What, women?
Yeah, the women.
Well, yeah. I mean, it wasn't problems. It was just that there were like 2 women that I remember in our laboratory. Period. Teachers were all women. I don't remember any male teachers. The superintendent of the school and the principals of the schools were men. But truthfully, I don't remember any male teachers at all, though there may have been. No, that's about how it worked. I mean, you didn't even think about it. It was just, hey, you know, that's the way it was. And nobody said, hey, why aren't there any more women here? Or why aren't there any blacks in this? It just wasn't anything that you thought of.
Yeah, right. So the SED was completely male.
We had women wax in the office of the SED. And I'm sure there was some over in the Manhattan Project headquarters building, the castle they called it. But other than that, no, they were all male.
What's interesting is that there were a lot of women who worked as leak detector girls at the K-25 plant. Were you aware of that? Did you ever see any of them?
No.
No, that's interesting.
I saw girls who were riding their bicycles back and forth delivering messages. And Doug Crossland's wife, Jean, was a secretary in one of the offices in the process area. So I don't know if there are other women around, but I was never in their office.
Yeah. Well, it must have been a lot of segregation, as you say,
Yeah.
of responsibility, so you wouldn't have...
Yeah, and you didn't even talk to people. Yes, I knew somebody that was at X10, and I knew people that were Y12, but we didn't talk about what do you do, or such, or people that worked at the headquarters, the castle.
So what was the demographics of the people working at Oak Ridge? You talked a little bit about that, but and where did they come from?
Well, the people that I knew closely, California, West Virginia, Massachusetts. I'm thinking of SED and wives. Maryland. Oh, I think Texas. Of course, I came from New York, and I know some came from New York. I have a copy of the SED yearbook that was put out that lists all of the SED folks at Oak Ridge and what school they went to and where they came from. And I think I remember hearing that they came from almost every state in the Union, but the ones that I knew specifically were not that many. I didn't kick around with 50 people, for instance, one from each state.
But you certainly knew them from California to New York to Texas.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Massachusetts, quite a spread.
Yeah.
A spread geographically.
Pennsylvania.
Right.
Others.
So it's interesting because some of the other population that's been heralded lately is the women who worked on the Calutrons, the so-called Calutron girls. So did you happen to be aware that we're...
Didn't know anything about them and didn't know any of them. But I've heard stories after the fact that originally they thought that they would have to be operated by PhDs. And then they found out that no, you could just train women, which is, that's cheap labor, without any education. Then they could probably do a better job than the PhDs because they were too impatient with things like that. And they did. But I didn't know anybody that worked in that. That was the people I knew that I were close to were the people that, again, were in the close group of young married people at Ohio State who came on to Oak Ridge. So there was here's everybody. Some of them went to Ohio State. Some of those went to Oak Ridge, so that now it was getting smaller and smaller as you went along.
When you were gathered together for this monthly meeting with the colonel,
Captain.
captain,
He was only a
a
captain.
captain, how many were like 1,000 people there, or just a few?
I don't remember, but I remember that they had these meetings in one of the cafeterias because of I guess because of the size.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember him standing on a table talking. Now maybe it was only one time, and I remembered it because it was unusual, or other than that. But it was, a very informal type of operation. And again, in our department where I worked, I had a civilian boss. He had a civilian boss. I had people I worked with and who had more or less worked for me, not officially, but more or less, who were both civilian and military.
And most of those military were SED,
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were all SED.
which is really military light.
Well, SED was, I think it was more or less of a catch organization for everybody that worked at the. Well, no, maybe not. Maybe the hierarchy such that worked in the headquarters. Some of them were probably not technical people, and whether they were officially part of the SED organization or officially part of some other military organization, I don't know. But all of the SED people I knew were technical. All had at least one degree in engineering or science.
Right,
Some of them had two.
right, right. So one of the themes of the Manhattan Project interpretation is how innovative and creative people were, had to be.
Absolutely.
that.
You were doing things that nobody had ever done before, working with materials that nobody had ever known about, and here I was in a laboratory, and it was decided that we needed a couple of more mass spectrometers. So we built the mass spectrometer tubes. You couldn't get them anywhere else. We made them ourselves, and I've got a patent somewhere. I can tell you about that. That's interesting also. We built the darn things, and heck, none of us had ever built a vacuum tube type of thing, and someone was small. And heck, we didn't even have the tools for it. And I had this bright idea and went down over to the dental clinic and collected a whole bunch of dental tools, all the things they use on it, and they were just great. The long-nosed tweezers and the hooks and the things like that, the little mirrors. And so we did things like that never existed. I told you that we were using this highly corrosive material in K25 that was pumped through the whole plant. Well, occasionally you couldn't have a welded joint. You had to have a bolted joint so that you could clean things out and such. And if you have a bolted joint, you had to have a gasket or something to make sure it wasn't leaked. Well, what kind of material could you use that wouldn't be eaten up by this fluorine? Well, I have been told Teflon was invented by somebody to do that. Polytetrafluoroethylene. And here's a brand new product and been used ever since. So it was innovative.
Interesting.
So anyways, yeah, there was a lot of things because one, we didn't have access to a lot of things we wanted, so we had to build them. And a lot of things nobody had ever built before, so you try it. And, and a lot of us played around with things. I mean, we had a glass shop there. I was fascinated with it. Besides that, we had our own little victory cottage, And occasionally I would go and had nothing to do. I would go to the glass shop and I would make stem glasses out of Pyrex tubing and things like that and take them back. And I burnt the palm of my hand off one time. My only war wound, which I didn't dare tell anybody about. So, but anyway, yeah, we did all kinds of good things like that. So I think I ended up with 2 patents. And we designed these things, and about, I don't know, 6 months later, some young Marine lieutenant, Marine Corps, comes in, says, hey, I'd like to talk to you about this and that. He says, I'm the patent officer for the project. Oh, okay. So we talked about it, and I said, I got a question for you. I said, I've seen Navy people, and I've seen Army people. I said, you're the first Marine I've seen on the project. He says, yes, that's a very sad story. He said, do you really want to hear about it? I said, yeah. He says, well, he says, I was a civilian working at the Nash building in New York City, where the original K-25 process stuff was done, as a civilian. And he had an engineering degree, and he and his parents were getting all this static from everywhere. Why isn't your son in the military? What are you doing? Couldn't tell anybody what he was doing. Well, why aren't you in service? And he took it for as long as he could, and he decided, just as I did, he decided, hey, I haven't seen any Marines in this program. So he took vacation. He said, I'm going on vacation, and he enlisted the Marine Corps. And he went through the Marine Corps basic training, and we got all through with the rough basic training. This is his story to me, so I don't know if it's true or not. He said, they came to me and they said, you got a college degree, we want you to go through officer training too. So he went through officer training, and then everybody's getting assignments, and his assignment was New York City, the Nash building, and he said, and the same desk and the same stuff I had left on the desk was still there. He says, well, now I'm on the project, and now I'm wearing a uniform and getting paid less, but I've got a uniform on.
That's great.
So whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's a heck of a good story.
Yes, it's a great story. And his parents were pleased.
Uh-huh.
Probably wondered why he wasn't, you
Yeah.
know.
So in any case, I don't know whether he filed the patent or not, but if they did, it would have been classified, and I've never been able to find out if there were such things, because there were 2 of them. But I tell people about it anyhow.
Well, there were 6,500 patents that, at least according to the things I've learned, under the Manhattan Project.
Oh, yeah.
And then 2,300 of them later were U.S. patent. You know, the others are probably all
Well, I
declassified.
didn't apply for it. It was just somebody saw it, saw the drawings, saw the things. It was a mass spectrometer tube that you could adjust from the outside. And I forget what the other one was. It was some kind of a pump. A high vacuum selective valve, because we were doing high vacuum work too. Anyway, so when I left Oak Ridge, I was very lucky. And again, Doug Crossland and I both went to work for Boeing in Seattle right after we got out of the Army. And the Boeing company, remember, this was right after the war, when jet propulsion was just being thought of. And we had had this first graduate level course at Ohio State. Boeing hired us to be part of a very small group to investigate jet propulsion and tell them what they ought to be doing with them. It was fabulous, and it just got me going off on all kinds of things afterwards. And I'm sure they hired us because we had been at Oak Ridge also, because we had this Manhattan Project experience. So we had to be smart or handsome or whatever. So anyways.
And how long were you there?
Well, I was only in Boeing for about a year because my wife got pregnant, and her parents and my parents were back in Long Beach, Long Island, and this would have been their first grandchild. And we figured, you know, we're going to be trapped. We love Seattle, and we love the Northwest, but every time we're going to have a vacation or something, we're going to have to go back there. Be better if we went back there, and then we could take our vacation and leave the kids with them. So I went to work for Republic Aviation, doing very much the same thing for Republic for $7 more a month. No, a week, I'm sorry. I went from $60 to $67 a week. They built fighter planes during the war, the Thunderbolts, P-47s.
And they were located in?
Farmingdale, Long Island.
Long Island. So how far were you from your parents?
Oh, I could drive to work in about half an hour, and we were 15 minutes away from the parents.
That's great.
So worked fine.
Okay.
Until we decided that, I decided I had enough of the New York area and went to work for Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica, California, and stayed there for 17 and a half years.
That's nice. So in all of these other assignments, did you ever run into other people who had worked on the Manhattan Project?
I occasionally would run into somebody, because a lot of the stuff I was doing was I ran Douglas's Propulsion Advanced Projects Group at one time, and so I was doing things like combustion and designing rockets and fuels and that type of thing. And also, part of my responsibility was space nuclear power plants and nuclear rockets. So, hey, I was an expert because I was on the Manhattan Project. Not that I really knew anything, but yeah, it was the badge.
So for people who aren't familiar with the space application of nuclear energy, can you talk about?
Oh yeah, it's very simple. Two things. One is the engine, by definition, carries with it its fuel and oxygen. It's like when you drive your car, you're carrying the fuel with you and you're taking the oxygen from the air. But if you're going to get out in space, there isn't any air. So you've got to, or if you're going underwater, they use rocket engines underwater too for torpedoes and things. You've got to carry your own oxygen or a chemical that will have a very large proportion of its weight in oxygen. So that becomes a problem if you're going to go to Mars or someplace like that. You've got to have two tanks and the weight of the two tanks. One tank to keep the oxidizer in, liquid oxygen or something like that, and one tank to keep the fuel in. And you've got to have pumps to pump it into the combustion chamber. Well now, if I could eliminate the fact that I'm burning something and I need fuel and oxygen, I could fly further because I have a lighter vehicle. I don't have to have two tanks and I don't have to have two pumps. So if I could have a small nuclear reactor and some kind of a gas or a liquid that I could spray into it and heat it up to the same temperatures that the combustion of burning oxygen and hydrogen, say, and then squirt it out the nozzle, I've eliminated the need for quite a bit of weight on my vehicle. I'm going to go to Mars. So they're talking a lot right now about going to Mars using nuclear rockets, which would just be that. There was also talk about nuclear ramjets, which was essentially the same thing. There's for electric power on space vehicles. A lot of the electric power now comes from solar panels. Well, that's great when you're near the sun. But now, as you go out to the outer planets, the solar energy drops off very much. And so eventually you get to the point where solar panels aren't going to do you any good. But if I have a little nuclear power plant on board, wow, I can have electricity whenever I want it. I can also have heat, which is pretty important. So that's the kind of thing that even, 50 years ago, we were looking at very carefully, though we didn't have a lot of the technology to do it. But a lot of space probes have gone up and have not only had nuclear reactors, but some of them have used plutonium sources. Now, plutonium is warm all the time. And if you have now this constant source of heat, and you can put some kind of a heat receptor around it, like a solar panel, that'll generate electricity. The Russians used to use it in the Arctic for lights and things like that. A little piece of plutonium, so all that kind of works. There's all kinds of neat things that you can do. And so nuclear is pretty important in those areas. And of course, there's the Navy has been running 100 nuclear reactors for over 50 years and never had an accident or anything. People don't realize that. There's the U.S. Antarctic Station right on the South Pole. All that power comes from a small reactor.
So how big, when you say small, how big is a small?
I have no idea.
Size like a tent?
I've never been. I would imagine it. It's small, because they had to get it there, and the only way they could get it to the South Pole is in an airplane.
That's great.
So, anyways, I did that, and I've gotten involved with the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History. Right now I'm a board member emeritus. And I'm not quite sure what emeritus means. Does it mean with merit? To all practical purposes, it means this is a guy who's been doing some work around here, and we want to hold on to him, but not give him too much, can't vote at the board meetings. But I've been involved with the museum for about 25 years. I made the mistake of coming in with some of my Oak Ridge material that I had, maps and things like that, and saying, hey, can you use this? And 15 minutes later, I left, and I was a charter member of the foundation and on the board. Sweet-talking lady that was running the museum at that time, long before Jim Walther. And so, I've been the chief scrounger there because I've gotten a lot of the material and stuff that's in the museum from various organizations. And when we built a new museum, I was very much involved in that. And that's...
It's a wonderful legacy.
Oh, it's terrific. And I've also been, because of getting involved with museums, I got interested in museums. And we have... Albuquerque, I have been told, has more museums per capita than any other city in the United States. True or not, I have no idea, but I think it may be. I eventually was president of the university's Maxwell Museum of Anthropology. I've been very much interested in local history and stuff like that. I'm right now chairman of the board of the Albuquerque Museum of Art and History. So that's keeping me busy.
Wow.
So I keep out of trouble.
I guess you
I
do.
also mow my own lawn and that kind of thing.
That's wonderful. Well, looking back at the Manhattan Project again, and obviously a lot that happened afterwards was sort of...
Fallout.
Yeah, fallout, right, exactly. I mean, it really... Tell us how it shaped your future life.
Well, it shaped my life because being an engineer, and it just gave me a step up over so many of my compatriots and people at the same experience level and such. I mean, I don't know if I would have ever gotten into this advanced projects thing at Douglas, for instance, if they didn't say, hey, this guy's done all this good stuff. It's certainly gave you an interesting, different viewpoint on things. I mean, having worked in this highly restricted, high-tech, advanced areas, and I've stuck with that all the time. I've been very much involved with the Star Wars thing, high-energy lasers and spacecraft and that kind of thing. And I think a lot of my background has been the reason for getting involved in that and for being allowed to be involved in that. Certainly gave me confidence that I could move into a lot of this.
So, some veterans I talked to have been very closed-lipped about their experience. They've been shy to talk about it, even with their families. Partly, I think, because they were told this is secret, keep it secret. But also, I think, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when there was a lot of pushback against nuclear weapons, that they didn't want to self-identify as someone who brought them to.
Well, that could be, and also in their 60s and 70s and 80s, they probably don't remember half of that stuff. So maybe that's it. But yeah, I know veterans who were in combat and things that were just so horrible that they don't want to talk about it. But I wasn't involved in anything that was horrible. In fact, a lot of the stuff I was doing was fun. And we learned a lot, and we did a lot, and it was useful. But of course, you couldn't talk about it at the time. And right now, okay, you can talk about it, but what I was doing, I was in a laboratory. I wasn't in the research and development, basic starting. I was in the work I was doing was things that helped the lab do its stuff. Quality control. We built machinery that would, I say machinery, things that went into the plant area that would tell you what the percentages of the fissionable material was. You don't go buy those off the shelf. You sit around and scratch your head and somebody says, why don't we do this, why don't we do that? And you end up, well, okay, let's build something and try it. So you did that. And of course, sometimes you did very simple things. Hey, I need a little pump that'll pump water from this barrel to that barrel. So you did that too. It was a good experience. And of course, wandering around Tennessee wasn't too bad either. Smoky Mountains. Of course, we only had 1 day a week. We worked 6 days. But you could get over to Gatlinburg and the Smokies. And this gal Margie, who was in our engineering department, her dad was the chief chemist or something at the Bureau of Mines Laboratories in Norris, Tennessee, which was only a half-an-hour drive away, so you could hitchhike over there and get fed. And that.
He made the most of it.
Yeah. Anyways, it was a great experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything, and I think it did actually affect a lot of what I did afterwards, because I was constantly at the leading edge of various sciences and things like that.
So when people call for, oh, we need another Manhattan Project to solve Parkinson's disease or cancer, or whatever the next challenge is, what would you say to that?
Well, I'd say that if your definition of having another Manhattan Project is having priorities, funding, a goal, a measurable goal, yeah, great. But it depends on what do you mean. But the Manhattan Project was a survival thing. It had a specific goal. It had essentially unlimited funds and assets and availability. So when people say another Manhattan Project, I don't think we'll ever see one. Because I don't think anybody will agree. Maybe another war if there was one. But got to remember, the Manhattan Project really did something. We haven't had a major war between major nations since World War II was over, since those bombs were dropped. And that's something. There's a whole lot of people alive today who wouldn't have been. And that kind of makes you a little proud.
Oh, another aspect of the interpretation of the park that the National Park Service has promised is to look at what happened in Japan. So often the story is told by us Americans with the crescendo being the bombs were dropped, end of war, end of story. And the Park Service has been approached by the Japanese to say, you need to tell the stories of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and recognize that. I think with the end that the mayors of those cities are leading efforts in the United Nations and internationally to end wars. But so there's a.
But people have got to look at things sensibly. We had a firebomb raid on Tokyo that I have been told killed more people than the nuclear bomb killed in Hiroshima. But you don't hear about that. So what the world is actually saying is, it's okay to burn a person to death, but you mustn't kill them with radiation. Kind of silly, but that's the way it is. You talk to Japanese. I spent a lot of time in Japan. We hosted a Japanese graduate student when we lived in Los Angeles area, just because my kids were teenagers and I thought it was a great idea. And so we've been very close to that family, and I've been back there any number of times. And it's just amazing. I was at the museum in Nagasaki, and because I've been involved with the museum here, I got business cards, and I can send it into the director and sit down and talk to them. And I was talking to the director of the museum there. And their whole museum, and I looked at it drooling, they had unlimited funds, and we had just finished building ours, and scrimping, and okay, we didn't finish the parking lot, and okay, we didn't do this. The whole museum was based upon we were victims. Had nothing to do with anything else. It was we were victims, and highly selected exhibits for foreigners. There was one Catholic church in Nagasaki. So they have a whole room based on the ruins of that church, so that some Catholic Americans say, oh my God, they destroyed our churches, But another time, I was with a group in Tokyo, and we heard a lecture by the chairman of the history department of the major university in Tokyo. And he was talking about history, obviously. And he said, you people have been laboring under a tremendous misapprehension. It's all been propaganda. For instance, there was no such a thing as the Bataan Death March. Oh, there was no such a thing as the rape of Nanking. Oh. We only bombed Pearl Harbor to make sure that the Americans didn't have the capability to interfere with our activities in Southeast Asia. We didn't want a war with the United States. It was all your doing because you insisted on following up and attacking us. Oh, okay. Interesting. But they're lovely people. I really like Japan. I had never told even the people I know there that I had worked on the Manhattan Project, because our Japanese friend that we hosted, his grandmother was killed in Hiroshima. So I definitely never said anything to him at all. I didn't want to bring it up.
But if he asked you, what would you tell him?
I'd tell him if he asked me. Oh, he knew that I was working on high-energy lasers and satellites and satellite weapon systems and things like that.
So if you could build a museum that would have copies both in Albuquerque and Nagasaki, how would it tell the story?
That would be interesting, because you'd have to try to tell the story based upon what the Japanese people think they know, and kind of work it around that way. I would probably emphasize in Japan the fact that dropping those 2 bombs and ending the war saved millions of Japanese civilian lives, even though a few 100,000 were killed on those 2 bombs. There would have been millions killed if we had to invade Japan. Not counting our losses, but just their losses. Because they were, again, what I heard, they were issuing pointed sticks to Japanese women, to kill Americans as they came there. Oh, interesting thing. I had an uncle who had an ex-Marine who had been, during World War II, was a civilian radar expert with the Army, traveled all over the world. And just right at the day after the bomb was dropped in Hiroshima, he was on an airplane going somewhere, and there was an Army colonel next to him sitting, and they talked, and the colonel said that he was stationed in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. So Hank said, I got a nephew who's Oak Ridge. Now this guy's a colonel, and I was a sergeant or something at the time. And so he said, do you know him? And the colonel said, no, I don't know him, but I know the name. And he's not in Oak Ridge, he's in Hiroshima, because there's a small group that was sent there, about 6 people, right after the bomb drop, to make measurements. They flew into Hiroshima. And he said, he's there. So Hank told the whole family. Of course, I didn't know about it at all. I was, still in Oak Ridge. And it turned out that I was the first alternate. But nobody got sick. So nobody bothered to tell me about it until the guys came back. And they came back and they landed in Hiroshima. They told the Japanese that they were the leading edge of an American division right behind them, and accepted their surrender, and then made their measurements and got the hell out of there just as fast as they possibly could. But I was almost there, except for nobody getting sick.